These conversations were recorded in the summer of 2020. We wanted to put artists who'd met through Green Man back in touch as we all try and navigate the fallout of the COVID-19 global pandemic. The results were so good that we couldn't not share them with you too. We hope they give an insight into how artists think, their experiences at Green Man, and what they talk about behind closed doors.
Hi there, my name's Jon Kipps. I'm a visual artist. I'm originally from Southend-on-Sea in Essex, but I'm currently based in London.
And I'm Nathaniel Rackowe. I'm an artist based here in London, and I'm going to be talking a bit about my project for Green Man with Jon. So I'll hand you back to Jon, and he's going to talk a bit about where he's coming from with stuff.
All right, okay. Yeah, so I am an artist, as I mentioned a minute ago, and this was, before we start talking about Nathaniel's commission for Green Man in 2016, I'm just going to give you a bit of background info about what I do and things that kind of correlate with my role at Green Man, which is helping Lexi facilitate the weekends during the artist residency, and talking with artists about the ideas and helping host them and this kind of thing. So yeah, this is one of my sculptures. This is something I made last year. It's called Lightning Bolt. With a lot of my work, I take a lot of photographs out and about town, and I also do quite a lot of research about quite specific objects. And then I sort of draw on design elements from lots of these objects and splice them together, creating new kind of hybrid sculptural forms. And with this one, I'd been looking at some World War II tank traps called Czech hedgehogs, which are really interesting structures made of steel that look the same if they're upside down or, you know, whichever orientation they are. And also coastal sea defence concrete structures that are used for protecting coastlines. And so there was an idea with this piece that it could be any way up, or suggest that it could be any way up. Next slide, please. So I'm originally from Southend-on-Sea, and there's a bit of a culture there of lots of cars congregating along the seafront on the Golden Mile and driving up and down and comparing all their customizations and things. And this sculpture's got my kind of lo-fi attempt at the iridescent car paint that I was curiously observing as a youngster. And I included this sculpture as well, just because there's another influence in this which links to festivals. And I go to a lot of festivals, and I've got really curious about the pop-up tents that everyone sleeps in. As a structure, I think they're really interesting, and these two ellipses that twist into each other to fold down. And so yeah, you can see that the subject matter's like quite disparate in some ways, but by jamming them together, they make these kind of new objects. Next slide, please, Nathaniel. This was a commission that I did with an artist friend of mine called Frank Kent. This is a really interesting space. It's part of the Royal Academy, but it's in London, but it's normally out of bounds to the public. It's actually the West Yard, it's called. It runs in between the Royal Academy and the Burlington Arcade. And Frank and I made this installation there a couple of years ago. And I put this slide in just because, as an artist, I'm really curious about how art can interact with an environment that's not necessarily a white cube, and what it means to bring objects into different contexts. Next slide, please, Nathaniel. So going on from there, this was a sculpture that actually toured around a bit. So I made this piece, it's called Fugu, and then it was a collaborative work with Stuart Bowditch, who's there in the picture. This was at Sonorities Festival in Belfast, which is like a experimental sound festival. And Stu's basically got lots of electronics and transducers and contact mics and things that are making the surface of the object vibrate. And then, so it's making its own unique tone. And then he took that sound and created a whole kind of soundscape with it for half an hour. We were really interested in, you know, as I said, kind of bringing artwork outside of the white cube and into different contexts, but also using sound to give a duration to a static object, and therefore help people to build a different relationship with an object. Next slide, please. And then this was the second outing that it had, which was a really interesting sort of domestic gallery space in London called May Project. And we put actual real turf down on the floor. Fugu, where the title of the piece is Fugu, and the Fugu is like an ancient Neolithic monument, basically, made of sort of, yeah, made of stones. It's like an underground chamber, and so we were kind of bringing the grass in to kind of shift the context again. So yeah, this space was kind of really curious to me. It was like art gallery, white walls, but still kind of areas of domesticity with the wardrobe there, and then like the grass, and then this strange object. Next slide, please. And then I had to include this one because I loved it. I got to put the sculpture on the pulpit in the Union Chapel. This was just before the sound check for one of the performances that we did. So that's just a little bit about some of my own work. And then next slide, please. But so what links to what I'm doing at Green Man is that I quite often over the years have organised exhibitions showing the work of other artists, and I'll just quickly show you a few images from a couple of things that I think are relevant. So this Stuart Bowditch, who was the artist that I was working on that collaborative piece with, he and I ran this series of events called well, the long term was called Unhyphen, but we, yeah, so the idea with these was that we were really curious about how to get people into like a deeper understanding with an object, and it's kind of ties in with this idea of bringing duration. And we basically organized these events that were 1 hour long. Yeah, so they were 1 hour long. There was always one artist paired with one musician. And the key thing was that none of the audience knew what they were stepping into. The only information they were given was the name of the artist, the name of the musician, and just the idea that this would be a collaborative installation of some sort, and that they'd need to stay there for an hour. And we gave them a meeting point and did it a kind of old school rave, illegal party way of telling them to meet somewhere, and then we take everybody in. So no one arrived with any preconceptions. This was the first one that we did, which was in Southend High School for Girls Gymnasium. And Gordon Flemons was the artist who made these inflatable sculptures. And then there was a really nice sort of electronic layered flute soundtrack by Katie English. Next slide, please. This was another really interesting context to show work. It was part of the same series. So it was a World War II pillbox on a farm in Retton in Essex. And yeah, you can skip to the next one. I'll go through these quite quickly. These were people going in on the day. It was quite a small venue. This was, so inside there was some artworks by Lisa Selby. She was really interested in bringing an idea of domesticity to these kind of war structures. And so she made these plaster casts of architraves and skirting boards and things, and kind of held them up against parts of the structure. And then next slide, please. And then, yeah, John Hannon is a really interesting musician and music producer, and he made this electronic violin soundtrack that he played live, and he kind of layered up lots of sounds. And people would kind of come in and stand around it, and you know, the context really did something for the sound in terms of the way it dissipated the sound. So I mean, it was one thing listening inside, but then other people were kind of listening from around the edge and outside, and it had like a slightly different kind of feel. But yeah, really into kind of playing with lots of these things, experimenting. Next slide, please. So last year I ran a really big project called Artist Village, which is a festival in Southend-on-Sea called Village Green, and it's run by a really great charity called Metrol. And Metal and the Arts Council supported me to basically commission 4 artists to make new works specifically for the public park and the festival. And yeah, the artists were Chloe Brooks, whose work you can see here. Chloe was researching an old bandstand that used to be in the park, and then she made her kind of scaffolding version of it using this scaffolding wrap and a drawing that you might be able to make out on the surface there. This was actually on the festival day. So there's Chloe Brooks, Brian Griffiths, Ali Isa, and Millie Peck were the 4 artists that I commissioned. Next slide, please. What was really nice for me about working on this project was that the festival was kind of like a really big launch. This is the way I kind of sold it to myself. Not sold it to myself, I didn't have to do that. But the festival was like a really epic private view for the exhibition that I was opening. That's the way I like to kind of think about it. And but then after the festival had been and gone, the artwork stayed in the park for a month. And the artwork that's in this picture is hanging on the side of the cricket club there. It's like a pub sign, an artist pub sign by Millie Peck. And the cricket club actually wanted to keep this, so that's a permanent artwork now in the park. That's sort of a legacy of the project, which is really nice. Next slide, please. I think this is the last one. So yeah, this was another really fun project that I did last year with over 80 artists. And this exhibition was called Odds, and there weren't any artworks in the show. It was all the peripheral stuff around artist practices. So the sculpture at the front was by Ebb Collective, and that was originally like a sort of standing stone sculpture that I made for a festival, but a forklift truck drove into it before the festival opened, and so it was kind of broken, and then we displayed the remnants. And then there were other things that were like maquettes for buildings. We had props from performances. We had childhood drawings from people that went on to be famous painters. And anyway, yeah, so that was a really fun show, and that was at Toma Project Space, which is Toma is a really interesting, if you haven't heard of it, it's a really interesting artist-led art school, sort of peer-to-peer model. And it's based in Southend-on-Sea in the Royal Shopping Centre. They've got a project space in there. And so this show launched that. But yeah, so hopefully that just gives you a little overview of some of my interests as someone that kind of works on the visual arts program a little bit at Green Man. And yeah, over to Nathaniel to give you an overview of what he's up to.
It's really good to kind of like have a little look back over a few of your works again. Yeah, and so I'll keep this bit quite brief because we're going to talk a bit about my work in relation to Green Man, but I think it's useful to get a little bit of background in terms of where I'm coming from with my inspiration and a few previous works. So kicking off things with a photograph that I took around the corner from where I'm sitting right now. So in yeah, this is on Seven Sisters Road, and it's a shop sign which is kind of like partly been sort of broken, deconstructed. It's showing the kind of inner workings. You've got this strip of raw fluorescent light, which is lighting the structure, and then you've got the little pinprick of the street light in the background as well. And I think that this image is at the same time inspirational for my work, but also really encapsulates, yeah, what I'm trying to kind of make permanent within my sort of art practice and sculptural practice. This idea of finding often overlooked sort of structural interventions in the city, and particularly being drawn to when they are somehow transformed or modified by light. So this idea that light is a kind of transformative force and a material. In my work, I kind of see it as something solid and something that can kind of push through boundaries and layers. But I love the idea that light can transform and create beauty from the off kind of like harsh or hard-edged surroundings that we move through if we are city dwellers. And I think there's something quite universal about that kind of experience of living through and moving through cities. So I really like the idea of kind of taking inspiration directly from what I see, but sort of trying to get to the kind of core of it, trying to find a kind of something that is at the one hand specific, but can also be universal and could be understood by people from different cities. So again, this is another one from around the corner. That's St Anne's Road, which is not so far from me. This is Stamford Hill. So again, this is all my kind of neighbourhood. And then this is not my neighbourhood. This is in Dubai, because I travel quite a lot with my work, and I'm always looking and noticing and photographing. And this piece, which is actually right next to the gallery that I show with in Dubai, a gallery called Llwyd Bibi. I was there installing an artwork for them on the facade of the gallery, and I got it done. I was just sort of wandering around a bit, and then next door there's this kind of like weird little petrol station, which is part of a car rental place, and for me, you know, that is almost already the kind of like a perfect sculpture. I love the way that it's just like such a kind of like a complete form and has that perfect combination of kind of like, you know, kind of raw exposed structure that's both functional but also highly aesthetic. You've got the colour, you've got the light coming in, all the ingredients are there. So in my mind, it's really not such a big leap to be like, okay, you know, how much further does it actually need to be pushed to become a true kind of sculptural object? And the answer was this. So this was the piece that was a kind of a direct development from seeing that thing and taking that photograph. So this is a sculpture I made for a solo show in Paris with a gallery called McCutcheon. And the exhibition was called Signs of a City. So it was using the idea of kind of like sort of street signage and shop signage as its departure point. And that's why you get this kind of like yellow acrylic corner. And yeah, and this piece was called Petrol Station Canopy. So as you can see the process was kind of like a stripping back and deconstructing even more, and using the light to create these kind of floating rectangles in space. And as will become clear, there are very formal concerns in my work, which I'm not shy about exploring and expressing. And there's a lot I think about in terms of like color, space, volume, structure, mass. And I think that because I'm so interested in how sculpture can affect your own physicality as a viewer, those formal concerns are really key to be able to understand the relationship between sculpture and person. Oops, no, where am I going? Yeah, that's it from the other side. So looking over Paris there with a conveniently beautiful sky on the day that we installed. And this was another piece from the same exhibition. That one was originally in, so using corrugated, these kind of PVC corrugated sort of roof sheets that you might find on outbuildings, or, you know, it's a very low material, but again, you know, I'm interested in taking low materials and transforming them, and again, delineating it by the use of kind of raw fluorescence, and then the fluorescent light itself is given this kind of like outer glow by the way that the material filters it. That show expanded. This piece, it's weird how some works just end up, you make them for a show and you don't think about them much. And a bit like the piece that you showed earlier, John, but from in the different locations, they just end up having a life of their own, and it's almost like you can't really, you don't really, almost feel like you're not really kind of like driving this thing anymore. This piece has been to so many different places. At one stage, I had to make a version that lives in the northern hemisphere and a version that lives in the southern hemisphere. The Southern Hemisphere one is currently in Tasmania, and this guy's in Beirut at the moment. I hope it's okay after all the tragedy there. Anyway, so it's still in stores in Beirut because that's where it was last exhibited. Black Shed Expanded is a garden shed pulled apart, filled with light, and then turned on its head. So essentially taking one of the most kind of like recognizable little structures of the garden shed, and even then the garden shed becomes the kind of signifier for architecture in a wider sense, because if you ask a child to draw a house, it kind of just looks like that. It's the kind of archetype. But again, a very kind of like low structure, one that doesn't really have much aesthetic attached to it. So I really like playing with this. I like the fact that it looked like it landed from outer space. I mean, there's a sci-fi influence that runs through all my work that is more apparent in some than others. And I think that there's something a bit kind of like sci-fi about this as well, which I enjoy. And there it is from another angle, so you get to see a bit more. But this was as part of an exhibition called Sculpture in the City, which is a kind of trail of sculptures around the city of London that happens every year for a couple of months, which is always quite cool. And this is from a different series of works using dichroic glass. So this is a glass, this is literally a kind of like almost a sci-fi material, because dichroic glass was originally developed for use in satellites and spacesuit helmet visors. It's a special kind of glass that, without using a pigment, it uses minerals and a specific kind of molecular makeup in the surface of the glass that can filter light, so you can achieve colour, but without actually having a pigment. So it means that it never fades. It also means as you move around the glass, the colour changes. So it manipulates the wavelength of light depending on the angle you look at it, which is really cool. Now, the reason I was drawn to it is because my work is so much about, as I mentioned before, about physical relationship between object and viewer. I was really trying to think a lot about how to make a static wall-based sculpture something more than something you just stand in front of and look at. And by using this glass, it literally forces the viewer to kind of like move back and forth, because until you do, you don't get an understanding of what's going on with the material. Yeah,
I've seen those in the flesh and they're quite spectacular, really hard to photograph.
Yeah, very. And this is a sculpture, again, going back to this kind of motif of using kind of low common materials and then transforming them through the use of light. So this was using neon with these cement blocks, and this belongs to a series of works that I also made in Beirut, inspired specifically by the city and using materials that were sourced in the city, and the neon was made there and everything else as well. I think this is the last one before we go into the Green Man stuff, and this was for a light art festival in London called Lumiere, which had lots of different artists sort of spread across London, and I did this piece which was called Sonic Spin, which was a series of interlocking rectangles that sort of described X, Y, and Z axes in space, and there was an animation of light that played across them. This work, along with this piece, which was just called Spin, were the two pieces that were the kind of precursors to my Green Man project. So in fact, this work was the first piece I ever did in a rural setting. So it was the first work where I didn't have architecture or a city or a domestic space to give me the tension between the sculptural object and its surroundings. Suddenly I had a forest, and I was like, okay, well, what do I do here? And my answer was to construct a fictional built space and layer that with a rural space. And I think we can talk more about that in terms of what I did for the Green Man, because I took some of those ideas forward. what was that? That's it, with the shutter left open on the camera, so you can see there were 6 of these objects, and the single cuboid would move around in space, so it almost looked like it was spinning. Okay, I've just spoken for a long time, so but yeah, this is I'll let you kind of like talk, John. This is the Brecon Beacons. This is the Green Man site when I saw it for the very first time in 2016. Is
that where the main stage would be?
Yeah,
at the bottom there. Wow,
that's what, like that stage. Yeah.
I mean, that field is so familiar to me, but that's quite amazing seeing it without that huge structure there. It's such a great backdrop, isn't it, for a festival? Yeah, I mean, you sort of briefly started to talk about this, but for people that you know, don't know, I wondered if you could say a little bit about how you kind of settled on this idea. I mean, you had these kind of precursor sculptures in the Forest of Dean and in the city as well. And then how did you end up settling on that idea for Green Man Festival in the Woods?
Well, so when Lexi first approached me, I think my work had been introduced to her by a common friend, and yeah, we were just chatting about what I had and what I'd done and what would be possible. And the thing to remember as well, I mean, you know, we can't have this conversation without also talking about artwork, but also talking about the practicalities of making an installation like this happen, especially
for sure.
Like, and that first year, the budget was extraordinarily tight, and as artists, we know what it's like. You're always with those. There are always the projects that you do, you know, where it's for love, really, and you're like, you know, I was really inspired. I was hesitant to start with about the whole idea of artwork in a festival, but Lexi inspired me and completely turned my ideas around and got me really excited about it. So it's like, okay, how can we make something amazing in this space for this kind of limited budget? And so I drove over. In fact, that was the first time I met Lexi. We drove over to Wales, and this image is of her being a very useful assistant and kind of like giving me an idea of how wide we can make a sculpture. And I saw the space and I saw the trees, and we'd been talking about previous work, and suddenly this idea to make this vertical light structure, which I think was the first vertical one I'd done, kind of crystallized in terms of looking at the space, looking at, you know, the kind of like verticality of the trees, and
how far in advance of the festival was that?
That was quite far ahead, I think. I actually can't remember. It's all a bit of a blur back now, but we had quite a good lead in on that one.
Because it must have been quite. I mean, you were the first year that we did the Green Man artist residency. So you know, in a sense that you didn't have the opportunity to kind of see what someone had done before, and then, you know, kind of like get a taste of things. And had you been to the festival before as a punter, or?
No, I hadn't. No. And in fact, I hadn't really had. I'd had a really bad Glastonbury experience in the late '90s that kind of put me off festivals for life, or so I thought. So I'd only ever been doing. I'd been doing like the day festivals and stuff like that in London, but I'd never I hadn't done a full festival experience for so long. So I really had no clue what I was getting myself into.
Yeah.
But I just went into it like with an open mind, and kind of like, you know, kind of we were just sort of firing on all cylinders. You know, but it was right from the get-go through Lexi, and as I started meeting the rest of the kind of visual arts team and the rest of the wider Green Man team, there was just such a kind of like energy of just like, let's somehow make something amazing happen, even though this is a bit crazy. And yeah, and kind of got swept up. Like these guys here that you can see in the image, the rigging guys were amazing. I mean, they went above and beyond to get this piece up into the trees. of like the kind of like suspended acrobatics that they were having to perform to get this thing installed was really something else.
Yeah, wow.
I think the next slide is actually of the work itself, so we can kind of reveal how it actually looked once it was up.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, it's yeah, I'm kind of, so I think if you know the context in terms of you know, what you were dealing with when you took on the commission and how you kind of approached it, I think that kind of adds like an extra layer of awe in terms of you know, the fact that this was only your second rural commission, and you know, you hadn't been to the festival, and it's you know, and it's really hard to visualize a festival when the festival isn't there, because the whole thing just arrives within like a month of it happening or something, you know. So it's pretty impressive that you went so kind of like, you threw yourself into it like this.
Yeah, and I think there's also, but I think that I like there was a lot of stuff that really drew me to this particular work, developing this particular work. There was something about that sort of temporary, chaotic sprawl of the festival that made me really like the idea of creating something quite crisp and pure that could just kind of create a bubble of space and light to itself within the forest. And yes, you're right. You know, I didn't know exactly what was how that was going to play out, having not been to the festival, not really understanding how people were going to respond to the piece. But I had this idea that as a kind of counterpoint to some of the other things that would be happening at the festival, this could be something quite special for the people attending.
Yeah, one thing that sort of occurred to me with this piece was that you're kind of the visual language is similar to what the festival is using in terms of like lots of lights, but actually what your installation created was quite a sort of meditative encounter, and in some ways it was like quite opposite to everything else that was going on in the festival, that's more kind of like attention giving or something. And then but this piece was quite sort of magnetic, and it seemed to draw people in, and they spent a lot of time with it. And yeah, maybe you could just, I mean, what was it like for you when the people first entered the site, and then you got to see people interacting with it for the first time? And what was there anything in the way that people reacted with it that sort of surprised you? Or maybe you could just talk a little bit about that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, for one, so the intention from the outset was always that people were going to be able to have a really direct physical relationship with the work. You know, I had a pretty good idea about how much light it would throw. And with the trees being nearby, I knew that the light from it would be creating this kind of sort of bubble of space beyond the work that people could enter into. And then in terms of the height of it as well, it was hung at a height where people could kind of like duck under the lower horizontals and kind of stand within it and be lit by the kind of work, by the structure itself. So from the outset, and in that kind of like development stage, I was interested in trying to push that side of things. But then how people ended up actually engaging with the work kind of really went beyond my my expectations and what I kind of like hoped. And you can see from this image as well, you know, people were sort of sitting underneath it. A lot of people would lie on their backs underneath it. And then something that we haven't really talked about is that there was also, and it wasn't a static light. It was a durational piece. There was a time element to it. There was an animation of light that kind of played across it. So people would sort of lie underneath and around it and sort of observe the sequence, which would run every sort of 5-6 minutes. The whole thing was sort of like dimmed down, and then slowly light piece by piece. And I think I've got a little, how do I play that? Okay, that's start playing. I've got a little video clip here, which is quite a difficult thing to record, but we can talk while this is playing. But something that was really, I mean, in terms of like being a counterpoint from the rest of the festival, as you mentioned, you know, I'd go and visit the work periodically through the night, and I sort of get down there and think that there's no one there at all, and it was just me. And then I'd notice that there were kind of knots of people like around the sculpture, kind of just like sort of basically using it as a kind of like, you know, chill out zone stroke kind of like art experience happening kind of in the middle of all the craziness of the rest of the festival. And I think it really, really worked from, you know, being able to kind of give people that.
Yeah, I think it was quite a sort of profound encounter for lots of people, especially if, you know, you're not someone that goes to museums or galleries regularly, or, you know, or even if it was like your first time at a festival with these kind of huge, amazing spectacles, and then to have something, you know, you'll be expecting to see bands and things, but to encounter an object like this was quite something.
I think that kind of like, just to sort of briefly link that into the sort of the wider approach of the visual arts part of Green Man, you know, I think that's been one of the great things about all the art that's gone into it. There's so much visual stuff at the festival, and that stuff belonged to, I suppose we can call it the kind of decor side of things. And the thing is, the contemporary art, set, exactly. The contemporary art part of Green Man works with all that, but it is a counterpoint. It can't be mistaken, or if it is trying to look a bit like that side, it's because it's doing it on purpose to make a commentary about it, which again is kind of obvious, or it's something completely different. And I think that's where the kind of curatorial side of the visual arts programme has really worked very, very well in terms of selecting artists whose work can sort of stand up to that festival environment, but still act as that kind of counterpoint for the people who are there, to offer a different kind of experience where they can just engage their minds and their physical selves in a slightly different way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a really important point, isn't it? And was that something that was on your mind when you were planning all of this? The fact that there would be this kind of like, because Green Man's got this quite recognizable branding, and that is sort of echoed around the whole site with all the decor on the set and everything. But was that something that you'd really sort of considered when you were planning this piece?
It was also a bit of a fear, because I think that I wanted the work to be a different kind of experience, and to what the other things that people would be experiencing there and seeing. And my concern is that people just wouldn't really get it, and wouldn't be interested, and wouldn't want to engage. And I was blown away by how, I mean, it was actually kind of bonkers that first year, because the first year around, you know, it was all a bit of an experiment. You know, we were trying this for the first time, and the first year there was nothing. I think there was almost nothing in the kind of like the booklet that you're given,
the program,
very, very little information about the visual arts program, and there wasn't much signage or anything like that. But after the first night, like, word of mouth started to spread about installation. And we were getting more and more people coming down saying, "Oh, so my friend told me about this," and it kind of created this buzz, which was mad, and everyone was just so interested and really and wanting to talk about the content and the ideas behind it. And then I realised that actually, you know, the stuff that Lexi had been telling me about to start with, the fact that she had always had this feeling that, you know, the people that go to Green Man are those people that seek out art in their normal lives. And that when presented by installation, that they were going to get that this was an artwork and be open-minded in terms of how to engage with it and be interested in having a conversation about it, not just with me, but among, I'll sneak down and hear people talking about it. It was fascinating.
Yeah, I think that for me is also why I really like working with festivals as a visual artist, because I mean it's slightly unexpected. It's not hugely commonplace with festivals, but the fact is that the audience that come are like curious people, and they're really you know, they're looking to experience things, and I kind of feel like galleries and white cube spaces can be quite intimidating if they're not like part of your kind of regular, you know, not something that you visit on occasion anyway. You know, if you're not really an art person, it can be quite intimidating to go into a big white cube gallery with really posh doors and blah blah blah. But yeah, there is something about the festival as a context that's quite welcoming to people, I think.
Yeah, I like that kind of, I like the fact that it's quite democratic, and I think that doing this project for Green Man back in 2016, I mean, I was always interested in my work reaching a wide audience and, you know, just being out in the world. But I think it's also made me think more or be more open-minded about where my art might end up going. And that's something that I'm thinking about. I mean, this is another subject, so we won't get into this now, but in terms of how the whole kind of structure of the art world is changing and the role of galleries is changing. I think it is now up to artists to be kind of like, you know, taking control of their art and how it reaches the public, because the role of the galleries and museums that did that in the past, it's shifting. And certainly for me, the way that I work with commercial galleries has changed sort of dramatically. So now I'm thinking much more about, okay, I want to make work, I want artwork to reach people. What are the different ways that it might be able to go out into the world? And this was a brilliant way of doing it, and a really successful one. Yeah.
One thing that I wanted to talk to you about as well was obviously most of these pictures are at night time. That looks like kind of dusk to me, that one. But yeah, so, and obviously it's being a light piece, it's really dramatic at night, and you kind of really get this sense, well, when I was looking at it, I got this sense that the light increased the volume of the sculpture like so dramatically, because it's not sort of, the work wasn't confined to the, you know, the 6 different planes on the cuboid there. It was really expansive. But how, I maybe you could just talk a little bit about how it changed, how the kind of how the relationship between the viewer and the work changed through daytime and nighttime, and what you were thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, going back to those images of previous works that I've shown right at the beginning, something that unified most of them was the kind of combination of kind of like raw structure and light. And obviously with these works, the kind of materiality, the structural sort of objects that I put into the work, they're sort of stripped out. The role that they would normally fulfill is them kind of like being done by the space that the work is in. So it's about that kind of interaction. So as a result, it means that there's a much more of a shift between daytime and nighttime. So with this piece, it really only kind of like comes to life in kind of like dusk and nighttime. But then I didn't put an image into this presentation, but in a subsequent permanent commission that I did in Denmark, where there had to be much more of a presence in daytime, I developed a kind of steel support structure that became a core part of the artwork. So in the daytime, it was much more about the steel structure, and then you got the shift between that fading away, being more about the light in the evening. But with this piece, you know, in the daytime, it's just kind of, you know, they just sort of read as white lines. Which is definitely quite intriguing, but very subtle. And then as it gets darker, it becomes, you know, a much more powerful and kind of like encompassing experience. But
there's something nicer about a sculpture kind of arriving each day with the dark.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that, because we're probably running out of time. So I just put a couple of images in at the end of this version of the work, because I thought it made for quite an interesting contrast. So after Green Man, I was approached by the Royal Society of Sculptors in Kensington, in London, about doing a kind of version of it to cantilever off the facade of their building. So that was, you couldn't have two sites that were more different and two audiences that were more different, but super fun to be able to have a work that went from, a Forestry Festival to
central London.
To central London, kind of like, Kensington.
Yeah. I mean, I guess logistically, was it like a little bit of a relief to be back, working with very still fixed buildings over like wobbly trees and wind and...
To be honest, John, this was no easier. Because it's a listed building, so I could not make a single hole or fixing into that building, and I had to make that thing float off it. So this was extremely, but again, this is basically the story of my life as an artist. If you want to make something look simple and effortless, it's just the most work to do that. And as well, very well from your own work,
And hopefully these talks are giving that little insight to other people that may have seen the work, and they'll realise actually what did go into it. And each piece and every artwork is a prototype. Every artwork is an experiment, and every artwork is a development. And that's something that I always think is quite useful to keep in mind. It's like each time you make the piece, you develop a piece, and it's a bit better, and you figure out to solve this and how to solve that, but then you want to put this extra bit in. It's this constant process of kind of like growing, developing, experimenting, and there's always going to be like mad challenges on the way, but that's also part of the whole experience of it. Great. Well, it's been really nice talking to you about all this.
Yeah,
it's
cool.
Nice to kind of revisit, and I've got my Green Man Cup from 2016, which I think was the year of your commission.
Yeah, and, mine's not so old, but yeah, you've held on to yours. And let's hope that we're both actually going to be in Wales for next year for Green Man 2021, right?
Yeah, for sure. Fingers crossed.
Cool. Okay. Thanks a lot, John.
No, thank you.